Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, amazing people all around the world of crypto and blockchain globally. And today I have another amazing guest. I have I have a subject matter expert in China affairs. He and I were senior executive fellows at the Digital Economist at the same time. I met him at an event over a year ago. His name is William Vogt. William, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jamil. Looking forward to chatting a little bit about how Beijing looks at some of the issues that you tackle here on the podcast.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. A different perspective is always good. So let me ask you first, though, to kick things off. What is your background and is a logical background for what you're doing now?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm a subject matter expert in China affairs and emerging and frontier markets. I'm a former senior fellow at the Digital Economist, where I focused a lot of my efforts on Chinese AI markets and digital authoritarianism. I'm the author of the book Foundations of the Chinese Internet, which I think has a lot of connections to the crypto world, of course. Um, and I've written several articles, most recently about trends in tech development that is being spearheaded by China. And that would dovetail well with not only spreading crypto or controlling it in the case of China, but also promoting things like the digital yuan.
Awesome. Awesome. So I know here in the US, right, we see cryptocurrency as an investment opportunity, but as a tech expert regarding China, why does China view crypto as a risk?
Well, I think there are a number of different ways to think about this. And part of my expertise is not so much what China does. You'll see a lot of analysis out there in on the internet and in the think tank community and in the financial sector about specific things China may do at this, that, or the other plenum or meeting or statement that Xi Jinping might give. My concern is more about how Beijing thinks about these issues. So I'm much more concerned about, I guess, to use maybe a sports analogy, I'm more concerned about philosophy than playbooks in this case. So when we look at China today in particular, we have someone in Xi Jinping who is really all controlling of Chinese regulatory policy, essentially. And he is someone who subscribes to the Maoist side of things. There's really kind of a dynamic here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, how it applies to specific parts of blockchain and crypto in a little bit. But there is a connection between more control over capital and a more liberalized economy. And the best way I put this in my book is if you think about political ideology as something that would be talked about in kind of a flipped way from when we discuss it in Western cases, where the more right wing capitalist approach is actually the more liberal version of Chinese politics. And right now we have someone in power who is much more conservative, and that's going to lead to more controls, more traditional communism, and more skepticism about influences from the outside.
So if I instead of playbook philosopher, if I look at a U.S. perspective, and some of the reasons for investing in cryptocurrencies are, especially like Bitcoin, are speculation, wealth generation, and fairness, right? So, what's China's philosophical view towards Bitcoin, and how does it differ from the U.S.? And then I guess, we'll start with there.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the big thing to consider is, China is a much larger country than the US or any Western country. And from that, stability, political, social stability is something that's naturally more of a focus. Because if you look at something like a revolution of 330 million people or however many exists here in the U.S. compared to 1.4 billion people, the impact is much greater. And there is some historical background from this. If you look at Chinese history, particularly in the last 100 years, there have been instances where seemingly small incidents of instability, particularly economic instability, leads to a lot of casualties, both physical and societal. So that is something that's always in the back of the mind of the Chinese policymaker. And I think when you look at any sort of democratizing form of finance, and particularly the lack of control over risk management, I guess you would say in the Chinese portion, but any sort of mass potential for losses, that gets into an area that is very central to the concerns of the Chinese Communist Party, which is anything that could create mass collective action. And I've seen this when I lived in China too, where arguments between two people, no matter how overt they were or how violent they could get, were more or less tolerated. But once three or four people engaged in similar conflict, then it was something that was viewed to be a potential spiral. And that's when there was more control over the situation, which is something that, I witnessed in my case. I was on a highway in Beijing and I witnessed a fender bender. And, normally when there's that kind of traffic issue, authorities will come and try and clear the space to maintain traffic. In my case, when I was witnessing this, nothing happened until a third person intervened and started to create more conflict. And then folks from the street came in and voiced their opinion. And then it became a concern for the authorities. So I think in the potential for that kind of spiral of losses and anger is something that Beijing is particularly concerned about when it comes to crypto.
So, where'd you live in China?
I lived in Beijing and I spent a little time in Nanjing. I've traveled across the country, but I've mostly spent time in Beijing.
Okay. Beijing and Nanjing are major cities. So you're saying there people want social protection. Like Gary Gensler here in the US used to say, "Oh, I'm protecting investors from crypto." Like that people didn't like buy into that. People didn't jive with that. Like there, that's expected.
Yeah, well, I mean, the government wants to come in and control the space. I mean, in my book, I wrote my book about the Chinese internet precisely because it's a manufactured, almost isolated space. So in order for crypto to really thrive in China, because right now it's very much mostly banned, and has been for a few years. In order for that to thrive, there would have to be Chinese crypto and financial institutions that would back this. This is not something where um, there would be a lot of tolerance for folks to go on the internet and go to Coinbase or whatever platform or whatever digital wallet. There would be a state-run wallet system.
Got it. So there's a lot of the industry here views really the conversation of crypto on price versus utility. I mean, you could go on X at any time and see arguments of utility versus utility, or the price, being too high on certain cryptos because there's no utility. And we claim that crypto should be nonpartisan, right? But it's a very partisan issue across China, right? So how does China, I guess, want to protect their politics? And you said backdrop. So why do they want to really prevent another Tiananmen Square like event because of crypto and
Well, it
blockchain?
goes back to the loss potential and the inability to cover, excuse me, that risk. I think that's at least from the minds of policymakers, that is difficult because there are fewer protections with crypto just globally than with uh, other financial mechanisms. There's no FDIC in the US for crypto in terms of fully covering, and that is something that has much more of a um, existential political threat attached to it in other economies, but particularly in China. And there's also, like I said at the beginning, um, the idea of these open, democratized markets and financial flows, that's really a domain of the right wing in China, and that's not who's in power right now. So that's that's the China that really opened up and grew at a huge pace. That's the China that became the China of today. That's where the big reforming voice was Deng Xiaoping. This Xi Jinping is not really in that universe. He is much more aligned with Mao Zedong, and um, you know has more of a focus on going back to traditional Chinese communism.
Like an isolationist approach.
Yes, also a really a control over narrative, and I think that's where I see a lot of the state digital currencies like the digital yuan kind of coming in here. It's much more of a nationalist project, maybe than anything else. Um, so yeah, it that's why you will see, I think, the Xi government have much more caution towards a lot of this, because what we see as purchasing potential or investment potential, they see as something that is very partisan and can lead to the growth of a particular faction, and that's something that's always a little concerning and destabilizing within the Communist Party system. One book actually that I'd recommend for those who are interested in this topic a little bit further is a book called "The Party's Interests Come First." It's by Joseph Torregian. It's a rather long book, but it is well worth the read if you want to understand modern China today. It's about Xi Jinping, but it's also not about Xi Jinping. The subject matter it's a biography of Xi Jinping's father, who was a very prominent figure in the early years of communist China. And Xi Jinping actually represents a generation of leaders whose fathers were prominent politicians. And that's also, so it really informs the mindset of what Xi Jinping looks at the world. And one of the key themes of the book is how sensitive certain narratives are, and not necessarily the kind of narratives you would think of. Of course, questions like Taiwan and the South China Sea and Tiananmen Square. Those are, of course, very sensitive issues to people at the top in China, but also things that would strike us as almost petty, of a certain who did what thing first in 1913, and the debate is taking place in 1960. So I think when you have that level of sensitivity, the small things are really magnified. So when you have this potential for a faction to pop up, the risk there for a politically destabilizing event is just higher. I mean, if she were to expand things and say, well, crypto actually matches Maoist thought or something like that, then this would be a very different conversation. But as of right now, it is something that it strikes me as very much part of one sector of politics. And whenever that happens, even globally, things tend to not move. I mean, we see this in the U.S. with the hyperpolarization we have here. If one party is staunchly against something or views it as something that is the domain of another party, given the way the system works, often there's not a lot of movement. And I think we see a similar thing here. We just don't have the open debate, and there's a lot. It's a very opaque system, so we don't see those kind of conversations. What I'm postulating is I imagine that those conversations are probably taking place.
I would think so too. So I want to go back to, you know, before I get I want to get into what you said about digital one. But before I do that, I want to get into philosophy. Now, you said you lived in Beijing and you were in Nanjing. I don't know if you had the opportunity to get to Lijiang, Yangshuo, Dali, or any of the smaller areas in China where Mandarin is not the dominant language, but English is, because the economy is all about tourism in these places. But there should be a conflict of philosophy between the big cities and the rural, most of the areas, kind of like when there's in the U.S. Right? In those rural areas, what's the philosophy toward digital currencies, and does it differ from Xi's view, from the city view?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is I haven't been to China in a few years, and things there change very quickly. Just thinking from nostalgia, there are some places near where I used to live that no longer exist, which is some of them are historical neighborhoods, which is a little sad. But that is to say, a lot of things have changed very quickly, and also, COVID was a huge event in China. One of the things I explore, I talk about in my book, is that we're really talking about a tale of two different countries when looking at modern China, between the urban and the rural. That's important when looking at anything involving digital technology, because that becomes an access question. So I haven't had a chance to take a look at the connectivity figures more recently for this year, but previous trends show that a lot of rural areas do not have the kind of connectivity that would be required to actively engage in digital financial markets. And also, there are the demographics also suggest that there may not be a lot of folks with the kind of skills to be able to take advantage of that connectivity as well. So, and that's also kind of an important thing to consider. There's also, I mean, there are dialect issues in China in terms of what have you, but this is where you can kind of see the trends that I was highlighting towards crypto being applied more historically in the imposition of Mandarin and simplified written Chinese characters as a standard throughout the country. So even though, yes, there might be not as well spoken, in my experience, there is understanding. And having that control over language was actually a key win for the Communist Party when they first came to power, was to establish that kind of central control. So when you have that kind of track record, I've always noticed in Chinese history that there is a motivation to keep repeating something because it worked once. So, I mean, we see this now with the trade war, where there's a lot of overcapacity, and we're going to keep manufacturing because that's our economy. Whereas the point where they are in terms of development may suggest having a more consumer spending economy, but that transition hasn't really happened as much, and that is very consistent with what I've seen as a Chinese government mentality for centuries. I mean, this is not just a communist thing. This is something that I've seen, in the Ming Dynasty.
Got it. All right. So you said you said narratives, right? Actually, let's talk about that first. Narratives. There's been a recent narrative. The in blockchain, in crypto, that I've seen is privacy. You know, privacy is important, and you have the Bitcoin maximalists fighting with every other privacy coin. Which is doesn't make sense. But so privacy might be seen as a negative here, or a reason. But people are like, not like, how does China view privacy from a blockchain perspective? And isn't that based on their viewpoint? Isn't that something that they want to get rid of, or something that she should embrace?
Well, I mean, this isn't even a blockchain perspective. This is a networks perspective. Privacy is not something that is part of, the censorship system is colloquially known as the Great Firewall of China. Um, that privacy is that's very much a Western value. That's a different cultural value that's attached. So this is just applying to crypto. Being able to not have your money tracked is very concerning to Beijing. And I think if there was a crypto solution or some sort of crypto light that China would eventually adopt, the privacy part would be, would fall victim to that. There would be some form of tracking that would come into play, and yeah, and that's having those trends is really important, and having that data collected is very important. China has been, very possessive about data too. So this is something that would fit into not only a policy practice, but uh, a, a priority for infrastructure too. There's a plan that can be implemented pretty quickly and efficiently for tracking this kind of it's not a, oh, I'd like to eliminate privacy. This is something that crypto would have to fit into this pre-existing firewall system, in this pre-existing Chinese internet. And that is, from my limited understanding of blockchain and crypto, that would change things quite a bit.
Yeah. So then your answer makes sense to my next question, which is, why is our central bank digital currencies, here in the U.S. They're Donald Trump said there will never be a CBDC. In China, they've built a digital yuan and CBDC, and they're embracing it. So that kind of makes sense that CBDCs are like their ally for tracking.
Yeah, well, and it's also a nationalist projection. This is something that communist states tend to do. There's also we talked a lot about this at the Digital Economist, how in many ways China is trying to play all sides of the development question, as it views itself as both a global north developed economy and a global south emerging market. And being able to show its prowess for both sides of that identity is really, I think, is always going to be a priority, not only from foreign policy, but also for the domestic audience, because there is a sense and a need for a constant social contract between citizens of authoritarian societies and their governments. And in China, a lot of that is tied into, I guess you could say, imperial greatness. This is a country that has had, it is the longest lasting continuous civilization on Earth. So there's a lot of pride in that. And for that reason, I kind of view communist China as a next dynasty, even though that's not something you would ever hear from folks in the Chinese government. But in terms of promoting national pride and development and showing that China is a great power, being able to have your own digital currency, and in the case of some of my other research, um, potential pathways to spread that as a standard globally, that plays well to both domestic and international priorities.
See, I'm not fearful, but I kind of see that too, them being the next dynasty. And what I see, a lot of people think that it's possible because that the Western countries are being taken over by Islamic takeover, right? In the West, and how do you see that playing? I mean, is that only a fear here? I mean, it looks like it has happened in the UK. Is that a fear here in the US? And then as a result, how can China really capitalize on being that next great dynasty that the USA once was?
Well, I mean that's a big question, and I think um, there are a lot of limitations to consider. This is where I would make a shameless pitch towards my book, because I lay out some of the challenges that China faces. So, like I said, the book is called Foundations of the Chinese Internet. It's published by Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. Um, and I also teach a course on Udemy about digital authoritarianism, where I incorporate some of the book content into a China lecture. So, would encourage listeners to go there for more. But there are significant social and political limitations that China has, and that um, I would say Chinese political culture tends to have. I mentioned about overcapacity, for example, of doing the same thing again and expecting same results, even at a different stage of development. That's not a one-off thing, and I think that's where looking at what China does individually, case by case, is not as helpful as looking at how China thinks and what some of the historical trends are, because there are instances in different dynasties where this has happened before. Um, Another example is in the previous dynasties, China had employed a policy of isolationism, which worked well for a while, but then the world became globalized, and uh, some of the emperors doubled down. And that led China to lose territory, influence, um, all sorts of, and reached a low point right before the beginning of the communist era. So the fact that we're seeing these kinds of trends again, I think points to a deeper limitation. And it also, on thinking more hopefully, I guess you could say, from a Western point of view, these are pitfalls that may not occur here for, again, political culture reasons. We have a tradition of democracy. Whether or not that democracy is healthy, I think, is in some ways besides the point here, because China does not have any tradition whatsoever. And this is what you can see there. Um, so, yes, there are some concerns. There are, hot flashpoints and whatnot. But I think those things are pretty well covered by the snapshot financial reporting think tank analysis pieces that you might see out there. It's more, looking at, oh, this is an overall limitation and something that has to be constantly tended to. Because another historical trend, like I mentioned, was the potential for mass social unrest is higher in China than in other places. So, and it's really it gets discussed quite a bit of what will break the country, and that's where Tiananmen got very, very close, and that's why it was such a large and traumatic event, and it explains a little bit of what some of the response has been. but we don't really have a lot of good parallels in the West to things like that. Tiananmen was not the French Revolution. It was something that was born off of very different circumstances and off of a political tradition that really grew independently of the rest of the world.
Interesting. That's right. Yeah. Awesome. So I want to shift gears for a few minutes here. You did a recent study, did some recent analysis on the West versus China, and you put it together in a presentation. I'd like you to walk us through that for a few minutes, if you'd like to.
Sure, I can do that. Okay, so prepared this table here. I think it outlines a lot of what I've been saying. Want to start first with blockchain. There are a few concepts here, really looking at them at a high level. So if they're happy to have more of a conversation with any listeners outside of this episode about some of the more technical aspects, I'd be fascinated at that conversation. But just looking more broadly, I'm comparing the U.S. market to the Chinese, the People's Republic of China, PRC cases that I've been discussing. When you look at just first off the idea of ledgers, Jamil talked about the sense of fairness that it promotes, and I discussed the idea of narratives. Here we're looking at what's an acceptable state narrative. What's the range of values and concepts that are allowed to be disseminated to the citizenry? And this kind of gets into a focus on risk. So any sort of data changes that you would have to a ledger, there's, in the US, we're afraid of losing money. In China, this is a risk of creating a new history or a revisionist history that may create some unacceptable state narratives. And for that reason, if we look at hashes, they're really kind of these security blankets that protect ownership in a democratized world. But in China, they can be used to track and monitor users. I mentioned how important that is. Looking at proof of work, this is something designed to resolve disputes, but in China, this is about enforcing conformity and making sure, like I said, that there are acceptable state narratives. Nonces also kind of help with the fraud side of things. But when looking at fraud in the Chinese case, we're really talking more about control over activities from users. And from that, the decentralization piece, we know about the capitalist benefits to it, but decentralization, that's where we get into the right wing liberal side of Chinese political ideology and potential factions that could lead to a reformist policy. So this is kind of looking at, perhaps we can think about blockchain as something that would be more attractive to China in, say, the 1980s as opposed to today. Because during the 80s, there was more of a spirit of capitalist reform. And the program that was implemented is known as capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That's not the direction that we're really seeing today. And I think that's why you saw in 2021 the general ban on crypto. And then the use of coordinated servers to maintain the blockchain. That's all about saving data to preserve ownership and access. But whenever you have servers in a Chinese sense, this is about having networks that are disciplined towards enforcing these acceptable state narratives. So really, the row on the top really outlines where the core thinking is, and the other building blocks towards the ledgers and the blockchain really are just designed to enforce that.
Awesome.
And then when we look at crypto, it's a little bit more complicated just because there's all the market um, considerations. One thing that I think is really important to consider here, and it's something that stands out as part of our digitally connected world, is transaction speed. The fact that we can do things we've never been able to do before almost instantaneously. That is seen as a great capitalist win in the West. But in China, this is about controlling resources and getting somewhere first. And, from that, that's where transparency becomes a little bit more of an issue. Transparency in a capitalist society is really about giving consumers a say in their own satisfaction and achieving satisfaction. Um, in China, transparency is a tool that allows the government to help citizens be more tolerant of the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. There's a lot there, particularly when it comes to journalism in China, that I suggest you take a look at in my book. There's also a really great academic text, Media Politics in China, by Maria Repnikova. That's an excellent work that talks a little bit about how transparency is used by authorities to work effectively with citizens in a censored environment. Because, I think another key takeaway is China doesn't censor everything all the time. It's more dynamic than that. So even though we have a ban now on the general crypto, that isn't to say that there might be some calibration in the future. So look at public ledgers now. That's having something more public and transparent. That also presents an idea of plausible deniability for China that reinforces citizen happiness. And when we look at mining, like I said, about reaching resources first with transaction speed, this is a form of state capitalism where the state will invest in the technologies and resources to mine, as opposed to mining being sold in the West as more of a private practice of value creation. This is going to be much more state-driven in China. Looking at the GPU question, that's really for China about innovation. That's something that will spark innovation. Although I will say as a caveat, I really hate the word innovation tied to China, because while there have been a number of inventions and developments, particularly in technology, coming from China, the spirit and culture of innovation in China can sometimes be limiting because of the political culture limitations I mentioned earlier. So I think some of this may be period specific as opposed to just thinking about how China has magically become an innovative power. Looking at forks and any sort of decisions that would need to be made within a crypto system, that is something that China would want to be authoritarian and as a specific direction for society to follow. And that process would be pretty difficult to do, or at least in a way that would seem organic, given how the crypto system works more globally. And that's where looking at enforcement control from proof of stake is kind of leads into that too. A big thing, outside of just the nuts and bolts of crypto is looking at power consumption. This is a big environmental issue. When developing the potential for mining, that's about, in the West, about acquiring commodities to be able to engage competitively in mining. Whereas in China, this would fit more towards their supply chain focus and as a way of creating some sort of comparative advantage in trade, which makes me wonder what the impact would be on in a trade war scenario with that. Again, with transaction capacity, so China, I would see that using it as a potential for abuse, as a way of maybe throttling different different speeds and different abilities to conduct mining operations, depending on whether someone was favored in the network. And that's kind of a big thing. China really wants to be able to choose favorites in the system, whereas in a democratized digital world, that is something that is not only to be avoided, but also appears to be less possible. So looking at scams and bugs, this is where we get into maybe some specific reasons for why crypto would be banned for most users in China. Because scams could be damaging to the cultural brand of the authorities who would be expected to enforce the law. And if they're not able to do so with some sort of speed, that would make the government look very bad and could potentially lead to collective action. With bugs, we have, that's really another cause for banning, because if a system can't reliably work, it can't be reliably controlled. Now, looking at kind of the investment side of things, we talked a little bit about price versus utility. In China, this is a political question versus an economic question. Right now, as I mentioned, on the left, we're looking at the left wing in power. That is therefore more of a political question right now than an economic one. And that, I think, will determine, that seesaw will determine the government's views towards whether to employ crypto technologies more into their economy. Wallets, this is something where we get into complaints. There's actually quite a bit of literature out there about complaining as part of kind of the social contract in China, and how the government does allow for certain forms of complaints, but within a bureaucratized process. So not having access to a wallet where you could prove any sort of theft or lack of access took place, that would cause a citizen to have less standing to complain, and therefore be more upset. So regulations and taxation, these are things that the small government folks in the U.S. just love. In China, not being able to regulate is very much something to be avoided, and not being able to get reliable tax income, particularly from something as lucrative as a digital financial system, that would be a cause for actually intruding into the system and perhaps acting as almost shadow investors or things like that would again manipulate some of the decisions that would be made to create new coins or values and the like. So and that that also goes into this idea of wealth imbalance. Economic inequality is well known to put pressure on governments from citizens. And like I said, China has more of a risk of that than many other places, at least in my view. And that's where the citizen revolt risk can come from a damaging economic shock. And if there's no intrinsic value to any sort of holdings, that can create a risk of making citizens angrier, which would make speculation more of a fear from the government to avoid those kind of situations. And then finally, if we look at inflation as a potential concern, this is less tied to the crypto system as a whole and more just another note about economics here. Inflation is something that really stokes the ire of many citizens around the world. We just saw it become an electoral determinant last year. But in China, this was one of the key causes of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And so, therefore, inflation is going to have a much more, it's going to be much more scrutinized than in other places because there is a very recent historical example of what happens when that is not controlled. So, from that, you can see that blockchain and crypto really highlight some of the ways that China imparts its unique worldview in the tech space, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to promote this kind of research. And I also have somewhat of an interest in personal financial questions a little bit more. I volunteer as a financial coach, and some of these questions, particularly about individual investment, are things that I'm actively looking into and supporting some international populations on. So from that, Jamil, if you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to get into this a little bit more. But I'll go back to the picture of just the two of us.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. There's a lot there. There's a lot to talk about. And I want to thank you very much for sharing that and speaking with me today. I enjoyed our conversation. One last question, really. It's a two-part question. It's how can people find out more information about you, and how can they find out more information about that research, and then contact you to find out more about the research?
Sure. Best way to reach out to me is on my website, which is www.williamjvogt, all one word, .com. I have all of my research up there, and there are also links to get in touch with me. I'm available on LinkedIn, and you'll see I have a few interesting international development articles that are coming out looking at how the tech sector, the Chinese tech sector, is expanding into some frontier markets. There's a lot of exciting new markets where China is expanding, some really great case studies to look at. And I will leave with one takeaway is, when looking at China, I would recommend to look at Macau, because Macau has a lot of global connections, particularly in spreading Chinese tech around the world that may be overlooked because it is a small territory, but it has outsized influence.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.